I wasn't supposed to be there that Tuesday. My flight home had been delayed. Mechanical fault. Gate 7, Heathrow. So I had an extra 7 hours, and nowhere particular to be. A friend had texted the day before. Go see the changing of the guard while you're in London. You'll regret it if you don't. So I did what tourists do. I dragged my carry-on to the tube, got off at St. James's Park, and walked toward Buckingham Palace like I had all the time in the world. Which, technically I did. It was a gray November morning. Not raining, but threatening to. The kind of cold that doesn't care about your coat. The plane trees lining the mall had dropped most of their leaves already, and they lay in wet clumps along the path, the color of old paper. There were maybe 200 people gathered near the gates, tourists mostly, phones raised, some with actual cameras, a few children perched on Father's shoulders. A woman beside me was eating a croissant out of a paper bag and getting flakes on her scarf. A man in a red beanie was explaining the history of the household division to his disinterested teenage son in what I think was Dutch. Normal. Completely normal. The ceremony had already begun. The new guard was marching up from Wellington Barracks. You could hear them before you saw them. The drum first. Then, the brass. That sound that somehow simultaneously feels like history and theater. People pressed closer to the fence. The croissant woman ate faster. I had positioned myself near the far left corner of the gate, slightly back from the crowd, because I've been in enough tourist scrums to know the elbows get dangerous. From where I stood, I had a clear line of sight to the sentry boxes and the inner forecourt. I wasn't filming anything. I was just watching. That's why I saw what I saw. There was a woman near the front of the crowd, maybe 30 feet to my right. Later I'd learn her name was Charlotte. At the time she was just a figure in a navy coat, dark hair pulled back, standing very still in a crowd of people who were all moving. That stillness was the first thing I noticed. Everyone else was shifting, angling, nudging for better views. She wasn't. She was standing with her hands at her sides, and her head tilted slightly, not watching the ceremony at all. She was watching the guards. Not the way tourists watch guards. Not with the make them laugh challenge energy, or the I want a photo lean. She was watching them the way you watch something when you're trying to count. Or confirm. The second thing I noticed was the bag. It was a large tote, the fabric kind, the sort you get from museum gift shops. It was sitting on the ground between her feet, and it was, I don't know how to explain this precisely, wrong somehow. Too heavy looking. She wasn't holding it. She wasn't acknowledging it. Most people in a crowd like this have their bags cinched to them like a second skin, scared of pickpockets. This one sat on the wet pavement like she'd put it down and forgotten it existed. I told myself I was being paranoid. The ceremony continued. The guard changed. The crowd applauded in that uncertain tourist way, like they weren't sure if applause was appropriate, but went ahead anyway. A child somewhere screamed with delight at the horses. Charlotte hadn't moved. And then, one of the guards, one of the sentries posted closest to the gate, in his scarlet tunic and bearskin, standing at the position of attention with the kind of stillness that costs years of training to achieve, he moved his eyes. Just his eyes. They went to the bag. Then, back to position. Then, back to the bag. He'd seen it too. What happened in the next 4 minutes I can only describe from where I stood, which was imperfect. I didn't have a guard's training or a security officer's protocol in my body. I had a delayed flight, and a paper coffee cup going cold in my hand. But I watched all of it. A second guard, positioned further inside the forecourt, walked with the rigid, measured pace they always use, the pace that never looks urgent because it is never permitted to look urgent, across the cobblestones. He stopped near a man I hadn't noticed before. Plain clothes, dark jacket, the kind of unremarkable that, once you spot it, you realize was engineered. They exchanged maybe 8 words. The man in the dark jacket turned toward the crowd. His eyes found Charlotte in under 2 seconds. He'd already known where to look. Charlotte still hadn't moved. The ceremony was wrapping up, the music fading, the crowd beginning that slow dissolve that happens when a spectacle ends. People turning, consulting phones, deciding what to do with the rest of their morning. The natural flow of a crowd breaking apart. The man in the dark jacket moved against that flow. He walked toward Charlotte with the casual, unhurried confidence of someone who does this constantly, and has learned that urgency creates scenes. He stopped about 3 feet from her, and said something. I couldn't hear it. I saw her turn. I saw her face. She didn't look guilty. That's what I keep thinking about, even now, weeks later. She looked confused. And then, underneath the confusion, something else. Something that looked almost like relief, which made no sense to me then. And still sits strangely when I turn it over. The bag was lifted by a second plainclothes officer who had appeared from nowhere. Charlotte was guided, gently, firmly, the way you guide someone who isn't resisting, toward the side of the gate, away from the dissolving crowd. The scarlet-coated sentry had returned to absolute stillness. You would never have known he'd done anything at all. Most people had already left. The red beanie father and his teenager were heading towards St. James's Park. The croissant woman was long gone. The crowd that had pressed against the gates 20 minutes earlier had dissolved into the mall, into the park, into coffee shops and taxi queues, carrying their photographs and their footage and their complete ignorance of what had just happened 15 feet from where they'd been standing. That's the thing about crises at places like this. They're designed to be invisible. I stayed because I couldn't make myself leave. I stood near the edge of the pavement with my cold coffee and my carry-on bag, and I watched the space where Charlotte had been standing. There was nothing there now. Not even a mark on the ground. The wet pavement looked exactly like wet pavement. A couple walking past me were arguing about where to have lunch. I nearly stopped them. I nearly said, "Did you see that? Did you see what just happened?" But what would I have said exactly? A woman was escorted away from a crowd. A bag was picked up. Two plainclothes officers moved through a public space doing their jobs. Nothing I'd seen was dramatic. That was the thing. Everything had been precise. I found a bench in St. James's Park and sat with my phone, searching. I'm not proud of how long I searched. An hour, maybe more. The park filled and emptied around me. Joggers, dog walkers, a woman feeding the pelicans, a group of school children in yellow safety vests walking in a caterpillar line. I barely registered any of them. I found a fragment on a news aggregator. 3 lines, no byline, time-stamped 40 minutes after I'd been standing at the gate. Metropolitan Police and Royal Protection officers are investigating an incident near Buckingham Palace following a security alert this morning. A woman was detained and is assisting with inquiries. A full investigation has been launched. 3 lines. For what I'd watched, the name Charlotte wasn't there. It appeared later, not in official reports, but in the way names always appear in the age of crowdsourced information. Someone who knew someone who'd been closer than me. Someone who'd been on the inside of whatever had unfolded between that bag and those 8 words exchanged on the cobblestones. Charlotte, it emerged over the following days, was not a tourist. She'd been there before. Several times. The same spot, the same hours, the same stillness. That's what had triggered it. Not the bag alone, not the watching alone, but the pattern. The Royal Guard's intelligence systems, invisible and constant, had assembled the individual pieces across multiple visits into something that required a response. And the response, when it came, was so seamless the croissant woman never stopped chewing. I spoke to a man named Gerald at a pub near Victoria Station that evening, still killing time before my rescheduled flight. He was retired, Metropolitan Police, 22 years, the last 6 in specialist operations near protected sites. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked, in that vague, tourist way, whether incidents at the palace were common. He smiled into his pint. "You'd be astonished," he said, "at how often something happens, and nobody knows about it." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being factual. He explained, without specifics, without names, the way career policemen explain things when they've spent decades handling what doesn't get announced, that the layered security around royal locations operated on a principle he called graduated visibility. The outermost layer, the bearskin and the scarlet tunic and the ceremonial rifle, was fully visible. Deliberately so. It performed stability. It told every person at those gates, "This place is defended. This place has been defended for centuries. Nothing has changed." The middle layers were plain clothes, trained to move like civilians, trained to think in patterns and crowds and behavioral anomalies while appearing to check their phones. The innermost layers, Gerald said, you never saw at all. The sentry at the gate, I said carefully. If he noticed something, he communicates without communicating, Gerald said. That's what they train for. Years of it. Your face doesn't move. Your body doesn't break position. But the information moves. He finished his pint. The ceremony looks like theater, he said. That's the point. It's not theater. What had Charlotte been doing? What was the bag? I followed the threads I could find, and here is what I've assembled, imperfectly, from second-hand sources, and a single short statement released by the Metropolitan Police 8 days after the incident. Charlotte was not a threat in the way the word threat sits in the imagination. There were no weapons. There was no plot with hard edges and a timeline. What she had was an obsession. The bag contained, among other things, letters, handwritten, dozens of them, addressed to members of the royal family, including, specifically, a young princess whose name appeared again and again in the pages that the officers read in a room I'll never see. The letters were not threatening. They were something stranger than threatening. They were addressed as though Charlotte knew these people, as though she had always known them, as though the letters were simply delayed, returned to sender, needing only to be delivered by hand since other methods had failed. The relief on her face when the officer approached her. I keep returning to that. The relief of someone who has been carrying something too long and has finally been found. The investigation that followed was not about criminality, exactly. It was about Charlotte herself, about what she needed, what had brought her to that wet pavement on a November morning, what the letters meant about the space between her reality and the one she'd been living inside. The Royal Guard had launched an emergency investigation. The emergency, it turned out, was a woman who was lost. And they had found her, quietly, precisely, without the croissant woman ever knowing, before anything more was required. My flight home left at 9:40 that night. I sat in the window seat and watched London shrink below me, the Thames bending through the dark like a crease in something folded, the orange sprawl of the city fading at the edges into countryside I couldn't name. The man beside me fell asleep before we'd cleared the clouds. The flight attendant came by with the drinks cart. Normal things. The whole machinery of ordinary life grinding forward. I couldn't stop thinking about the sentry. Not Charlotte. Not Gerald and his graduated visibility. Not the letters, or the investigation, or the careful invisible machinery that had assembled around one woman standing still in a crowd. The sentry. He stood at his post through all of it. The band, the ceremony, the crowd, the dispersal. He detected something the 200 people around him had missed entirely. He communicated it through some channel I can't fully imagine. A look, a position, a signal trained so deep into muscle memory that even he might not consciously process what he was doing in the moment of doing it. And then, he returned to stillness. No one clapped for him. No one even looked at him. That's what the training is for. Not to be seen acting, but to act without being seen. To hold a thing together at the seams while the surface shows nothing but ceremony and history and the steady promise that everything is fine. He stood there in his scarlet coat while the crowd took their photos. He will stand there tomorrow. I've been back in my own city for 3 weeks now. The delayed flight has become a story I tell at dinner parties. Not the full version, not the way I've written it here, but the edited version that fits between the appetizers and the main course. I happened to be at Buckingham Palace when something happened. Nobody noticed. It was wild. People find it interesting for about 45 seconds. Then, someone asks if the palace is worth visiting, and we talk about that instead. I understand it. I live in that same ordinary current. I pay my bills and walk my dog and check my phone and go days without thinking about sentry boxes or wet November pavement or the expression on a stranger's face when someone finally came to find her. But then, sometimes I'm in a crowd, at a concert, or a market, or an airport terminal, and I catch myself doing it. Looking at who isn't moving. Looking at who is watching instead of watching what everyone else is watching. Looking at bags that are too settled on the ground. I've caught nothing. I'm not trained. I'm just a person with a delayed flight and a rearranged understanding of what security looks like when it's done properly. It looks like nothing. It looks like a guard standing still. The Metropolitan Police statement, in full, said that no charges were brought, that the woman detained was provided with appropriate support services, and that the investigation was ongoing as a precaution. The royal household declined to comment. There were no follow-up stories. No photographs. No footage that I've been able to find, despite 200 people having had their phones raised at that gate on that morning. Charlotte didn't appear on anyone's video. She'd been standing at the wrong angle, or the right angle, depending on how you look at it, tucked into the geometry of the crowd at a spot where cameras naturally pointed elsewhere. Or maybe someone, somewhere, had understood that the most compassionate thing that could be offered to a woman who had been found, after however long she'd spent being lost, was the small mercy of not being found by everyone. I think about what Gerald said at the pub. You'd be astonished at how often something happens, and nobody knows about it. He was talking about security. He was talking about incidents. But I've started thinking he was also talking about people. How many times have you stood in a crowd and been invisible in a way that was slowly costing you something? How many times have you set something down at your feet that you'd carried too far and for too long? How many times has someone, somewhere, noticed, really noticed, and chosen to respond with precision instead of spectacle? The Royal Guard launched an emergency investigation. It found one woman. It found her without sirens, without breaking the ceremony, without letting the 200 people with their phones and their croissants and their Dutch language history lessons know that the whole geometry of the morning had quietly reorganized itself around a stillness in the crowd. That's not theater. That's something else. That's the kind of care that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just shows up in the right place, reads the right signal, moves at the right speed, and finds you before you've finished being lost. I hope Charlotte is okay. I don't know if I'll ever know. That might be the most